so much for having me. This is joint work with Emma Harrington, who's here, as well as with Mandy Palace. And the standard disclaimer applies that the views do not represent the firm we are studying or the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So as we all know, very few people were working from home before the pandemic, but even now as we're coming out of the pandemic, firms tend to be fairly divided about how they are viewing the office. On the one hand, we have some folks like Mark Zuckerberg saying, actually, a lot of people are more productive now that they're able to work from home. And on the other side, you have some folks who are embracing the office. So here you have James Gorman of Morgan Stanley, who said, the office is where we teach people, it's where our interns learn, and that's how we develop people. So this paper takes seriously the idea that these are not necessarily in conflict. It's totally possible that you could have remote work boosting your productivity, particularly because we are doing this at the expense of developing people. And so we're going to ask, does sitting together increase mentorship, potentially at the cost of immediate output? We're going to test this theory in the context of a Fortune 500 company where we can look at software engineers. Software engineers are an interesting group to look at, particularly because we can see data on mentorship in the context of code reviews, and I'll talk about what that looks like in a minute. And then we can also see their output in terms of the number of programs that are produced. We're going to leverage the fact that at this particular company, there was variation in proximity. So before the pandemic, they had two main buildings on their campus, and some teams were able to sit together, and those ones would have daily stand-up meetings in person. Then there were other teams that were separated across the two buildings, and we think of these as multi-building teams, where a lot of them would meet online. And because of that, they sort of proxied for what it might look like if you were working remotely anyway. And this was all based on desk availability. So we can think of the fact that when these offices closed, we had differential loss in proximity. And so we'll use a difference in difference design to try to understand the impact of sitting next to your coworkers. So we'll go briefly through a model that sort of disciplines how we're going to think about it, and then talk a little bit more about our findings. So in our model of mentorship, each worker is going to live for 2 periods, first as a junior, then as a senior, and they're paired together. They either sit together or apart. And seniors have to give some feedback to their juniors, and that is observable by the firm. But there's this additional depth of feedback, which we're going to call mentorship, and that juniors can ask for, and seniors can either choose to give or not give. And that part is very hard to observe. So I think in the academic context, you can imagine we have to have a certain number of grad students that we're mentoring, but the depth with which you're thinking about their work or how frequently you meet with them is much harder to observe. And so we're going to hope that mentorship actually makes juniors more productive as seniors, but there's an opportunity cost both for juniors and for seniors when they're giving and receiving feedback. So this reduces their output. And because we're not rewarding the mentorship that we can't see, it leads to decreased pay as well. Additionally, we say that asking for mentorship is costly. So it is difficult to ask somebody to exert more time on you. And so these juniors are going to ask for in-person only, where it's potentially less imposing. And likewise, it's socially awkward to reject people when they're asking for mentorship. And so seniors are going to agree to give this mentorship, but only when asked. And so this gives us several testable predictions. It's going to say that sitting together increases mentorship by increasing asks for it. It decreases programming output, and it reduces pay. And then having sat together also increases human capital. So conditional on sitting together, it's going to increase pay later and increase quits for better job. So we're going to be able to test these in our setting. And so just to speak a little bit about what this code review process looks like and what the job of a software engineer is, we are looking at 1,055 software engineers at a Fortune 500 company, and we can see their online mentorship. So they give peer comments to one another. We have about 175,000 of those on 30,000 pieces of code. We can also see personnel data, which will tell us about their proximity to their collaborators, their pay raises, and quits. Our sample has been at the firm for about a year and 6 or 16 months. They are pretty young. They're only about 29 years old. And they're about 81% male, which is perhaps not surprising. Nationally, software engineers are about 75% male. And only 16% of these engineers are parents. So the code review process, because they don't necessarily want you to introduce a really big bug into the code, when you're going to change code, you will create a branch where you will then edit. And before you deploy that code, there is a mandatory review process where a peer will go through your code, potentially flag issues. You might iterate back and forth, and then it'll be merged back into the code base. So it'll be deployed at that point. And giving this mentorship is an essential element of an engineer's job. So here I have just a sample of what a job looks like when they're advertising at Microsoft, where it says 2 of the responsibilities are about providing high quality code review feedback and coaching and mentoring other people. We also find that these comments are actually constructive. So we did a principal components analysis to try to generate those sort of themes in these content. And we're finding that they're about interacting with databases, they're about who owns the code, it's about function output and code testing. So all of these are actually highly technical. We additionally had software engineers outside this firm review a random subset of the comments to try to understand, are these helpful comments? And we find that the vast majority of them are in fact helpful, that 70% are likely to cause change in the code, and about 60% are explaining their reasoning. So they're very much constructive, the comments. Okay, so what do we find? Here, we had predicted that sitting together is going to mean more mentorship for people who are in one building teams, and that after the offices close, we're going to see a bigger decrease in mentorship for one building teams. And that's exactly what we find. So in blue, I'm showing you the engineers who are on one building teams, and they're receiving about 22% more comments on their programs than the people who are in multi-building teams. And if you thought that this is just happening because people on one building teams are chattier or they actually need more assistance, then that would persist even after offices close. But when you can see the gray line is when offices were closing, bless you, what we actually see is that a decrease going on there. So that gap almost entirely closes, which tells us that this is something about actually sitting in close proximity to other engineers. That was just the raw thing. We also have included time-varying engineers, time-varying tenure, as well as program scope, because you could imagine you might get more comments if you are writing a longer or more in-depth program. And additionally, we'll include controls for an engineer fixed effect, time controls of age, and other demographics. Throughout, we're going to be clustering by engineering team. And so you can see, even when we conclude our preferred set of controls, there is, again, this statistically significant decrease. I'm going to show you one table which shows you as we are including each and every one of these controls. And in that top row, it's showing you that our difference in difference actually remains remarkably steady even as we add our additional controls. And that's notable because in the bottom row, you can see that the amount of variation that we're explaining goes from about 2% to about 50%. In the light blue column, that's our preferred specification, and that's what future annotated estimates are going to show you. So we also have a placebo check here, which is that if you're sitting near teammates, that should impact only feedback from other teammates and not from non-teammates. That sitting next to your teammates should not impact what happens with people who are not your teammates. And about 1/3 of comments are from non-teammates. And that is exactly what we see. So in the blue, you can see that we have this statistically significant decrease, but in the gray, it shows that comments from non-teammates have no impact whatsoever about whether or not you were sitting with your teammate. So this is robust to various different measures of feedback, the total length of your comment. It also shows up in the speed of the feedback. It shows up in terms of each one of those principal component analyses that you can see the same pattern for each one of those. And then it also, we see suggestive complements in terms of other references to Slack or other means of communication. And then we find that this is robust in a number of different ways that in the interest of time, I'm going to skip. We do find evidence that this is mentorship. So one of the things that we look at is that this is driven by feedback to junior engineers. So on the left-hand side here, I'm showing you people who have been there at the firm less than the 16-month median amount of time. And on the right-hand side, it's comments to people who have been there for longer. So you can see that, first of all, in levels, the people who have been there a short amount of time are just getting more feedback. They need more feedback, but also the difference about being on the one building team is coming from the people who are more junior. This also shows up if you're thinking about this by age, with an independent effect. It's also driven then by feedback from senior engineers. So again, you can see that the senior engineers are providing more of this commentary, and that it is particularly potent that the senior engineers who are on one building teams are the ones who are giving this additional feedback. So far we've shown you that there is this piece going on, and that it's from juniors or from seniors to juniors. So here we're also going to show you one more piece about mechanism. So we're looking in terms of externalities of having a distant teammate. So we're looking at, if I am on a multi-building team, what happens to the feedback of people who are sitting together anyway? And we find that teammates who are sitting in the same building, if they have one teammate who is elsewhere, their conversation is still decreased. So it's simply the fact that we are now having our meetings remotely. Even though I'm still sitting next to you, I still see that cost. So we have about a 13% less feedback when one teammate is in another building. You can also do this same thought experiment actually before COVID. So there we can see that for people who were on certain teams where they added somebody to their team, and that person happened to be in a different building. So they shifted from being a one building team to a multi-building team. Those are the people in orange. You see a dramatic decrease in the amount of feedback that's going on. Whereas the people who had somebody who are added to their team, but it doesn't change whether or not they were a one building team, then there's no difference in the amount of feedback happening. So both of these, it suggests that even one member who is elsewhere will negatively impact the people who are sitting together. So the takeaways from this section are we're finding that proximity does increase online feedback for junior engineers, specifically that's coming from senior engineers, and that proximity is increasing contact with these potential mentors. I will say that basically we are looking at online feedback. So you should think of this as a lower bound, because if you think that sitting together, it also means that it's increasing the amount that we're schmoozing and we're chatting, we're not capturing that at all. This is purely the digital measure that we're seeing. So then on the next side, we're wondering, what is the impact on programming output? So here we had predicted that when the offices are open, there's going to be fewer programs that are written because actually receiving and giving that mentorship takes some time. But that once offices close, there's going to be a relative increase in programs for the one building team because they are no longer going to be giving as much of that feedback. And so that's exactly what we see, that the people who are on one multi-building teams were actually producing, again, about 23% more programs, and that we see this decrease over time. And so there's this increase in the people who are on one building teams when they're no longer spending as much time on the mentorship. Again, this is driven by the people who are actually giving the feedback, the senior workers. You see that those ones in particular were the ones who were going to be affected most potently by this. So again, this is robust in terms of various different measures of programming output, and we think that it's unlikely to be due to shocks to specific engineering groups because it shows up again in different types. So far, we've basically said sitting together increases mentorship, but it decreases output. And together for a firm, this then creates a now versus later trade-off, that on the one hand, I could have some additional productivity now, but it might come at the cost of a less skilled workforce later on. We do look at whether this is differential by gender. As I mentioned, 81% of our engineers are male, but we see a bigger impact on mentorship for women. So, and female programmers are, if they're on a one building team, they're receiving more feedback than male programmers on one building teams. And female engineers on multi-building teams are receiving less feedback than male engineers on multi-building teams. So this effect is true for both types of engineers, but it's just much more potent for female engineers. And we can see that the impact on mentorship done by women, so this is the commenters, no longer people who are receiving, again, is more potent for women. And that this also shows up in the mentorship because women are providing more mentorship, there's also a greater output cost for women. So female engineers are then producing fewer programs when they're on one building teams. So taken together, we can see that for female engineers, this trade-off is even more potent. It's more essential for junior engineers training, but it's more costly for senior engineers output if they're female. We then think about what happens in terms of career outcomes. And as I mentioned, you could imagine that if we are then giving more training to people who are on one building teams, then they are more skilled. And so what we can see here is that if the offices are open, juniors who are on one building teams might be paid less because they are spending more time on mentorship and they are producing less. And indeed, that's exactly what we see. And so here I'm showing you the dot is the point estimate on a difference in difference, and that when offices are open, we see that the differences in mentorship do mean that people on one building teams are paid less. However, once offices are closed, there's no additional mentorship. So now we're just looking at the impact of having received that mentorship beforehand. And so the people who are on one building teams are now more skilled. And so you should see that they are paid more relative to the people who are on multi-building teams. We also see this in terms of quits. So after COVID-19 came and offices closed, you can imagine that you can switch to more productive firms much more easily because you don't need to move. All of this is remote. And so those who are particularly more skilled, right, those who have benefited from receiving this mentorship, those are the people who are going to be able to move more. And so you see overall just an uptick in ability to leave or people quitting, but it's particularly potent for the people who then had been trained before. And we also, for about 2/3 of this sample, we can see where they went and what job they took. And so we can use Glassdoor data to compare with their job beforehand and their job afterward. And we can see that about 78% of the quits are to higher paying jobs. There is no differential before and after whether or not you are going to a higher paying job, but it does suggest that this massive increase is coming from people going to higher paying jobs. So then we can think about what would the firm be doing if they were sort of cognizant about this. And so that sort of gets to the firm policy. And we can think if the firm was really cognizant of the benefits of mentorship and that they may exceed the costs, then we would imagine that when the offices are open, they would keep junior engineers and mentors on site. But once proximity is difficult, so once offices are closed, they might hire more experienced engineers. So we'll test that as well with our firm. And so here, what I'm showing you along the x-axis is engineer job level. So the most junior people are the L1s, and the most senior are the L4s and above. And you can see that the most junior people, as well as the most senior people, the people who would be mentors, those people are the ones who are in the office before COVID-19. And then additionally, the people in green, those are the managers, and you can see that most of them are also there. And so this is suggestive that the firm is really trying to make sure that those who need mentorship and those who can give mentorship, those are the people who are really especially in the office. And this shows up similarly when you have controls, and also if you're looking by parenthood status. As I mentioned, only 16% of our sample are parents. But likewise, when you look at the office nationally, here we're looking at data from the Household Pulse survey, you can see that it's the most junior people, the youngest people, and the people who are a little bit more senior who are in the office. And again, we can't really say anything about whether that's preference or firm policy, but it does seem to be showing beyond just our firm. And then second was the question of once we are remote, who is the firm choosing to hire? So in the gray, I'm showing you the percent of people who are hired by this firm. So before the office closed, they were doing most of their hiring was at this very junior L1 level. And they did hire a little bit at L2, L3, L4, but is much less frequent. However, after the office closed, that's this in the blue triangles, you can see that they shifted away from hiring junior people who they would have to train and shifted toward people who were already trained. And so this is suggestive that they were aware of this sort of build versus buy trade-off, that if it's harder than to be be mentoring people, they're more likely to be hiring people that they don't need to do as much mentorship for. So I know it's a bit of drinking from a fire hose, but what have we shown you is that proximity increases online feedback for juniors, but mentorship has this opportunity cost, especially for seniors, and we see this decrease in programmatic output, and that this trade-off is actually more acute for women. We see that this trade-off then changes the pay path as well as influencing quits, and that firm policy suggests that it believes that the firm itself believes that proximity's benefits exceed the costs. We think that this also provides one answer to why remote work might have been rare before COVID, right? That if firms are aware that mentorship is extremely valuable, then the fact that, you know, workers might have been willing to pay 8% of their wages for the additional flexibility of working from home, and that you saw higher productivity, that still might be outweighed by these mentorship costs. So thank you so much. We would welcome feedback both online or in person.
Hi, thank you. Can you say something about team size that you didn't mention? In particular, I was intrigued by the result that is enough that one team member leaves to produce the effects you showed. If it is about communication, friction, coordination among team members, then we would probably see that effect not to be really relevant if just one person goes away. So can you say something about that?
Yeah, so teams are about 5 people. And so one person is a relatively large portion of that. But I think the other piece that's going on there is that software engineers, it's fairly standard that they'll use the agile management system, which means that they will have daily meetings to say, this is what happened yesterday, this is what's going to happen today, and these are my barriers. And those happen in real time, no matter if you're remote. But once you're then separated across buildings, those are going to happen online rather than in person. And it seems that one of the things we think about is that just the schmoozing before and after allows people to sort of say, oh, I'm working on this thing. Can you give me more feedback on it? We see a similar thing. I didn't show this, but in these 2 buildings, one of them has 74% of the engineers and the other has the remainder. And you can see that if you're in the bigger building, which potentially allows you to sort of bump into more people, you see a similar thing, that they get more feedback from non-teammates. So you could imagine just the ability to sort of talk in person then means that you're able to get more of that online feedback.
Would the company that you are working with allow you to run programs that measure code complexity and parse for comments? So I work at an organization that does this kind of code review, and a lot of the time I find myself commenting on junior staff's work to say, hey, please describe this better, or hey, you can simplify this and like make it less buggy. And so like the cycle complexity of the code, which you can pick up from a program, would be like a measure of quality, a potential measure of quality.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't actually have the code content. We only have the comment content. And so we can't see if code quality is increasing or if bugs are increasing, because they also don't peg bugs directly to the engineer. So I would love that, but no, I don't think that we're going to be able to get that data.
One thought is, this is actually great. I've read the study before. It's really been insightful. Thinking about if there's interventions that companies can put in place to actually prompt teams that are distributed to actually do this on a more regular basis. The real challenge here for most every firm, which is you can't unscramble an egg. Like if you look at Microsoft's data, they've gone from 61% of teams being co-located pre-pandemic to 66% being spread across cities, not just buildings. And I worked at Slack in pre-pandemic. I actually ran a product and engineering team. We debated remote teams for 3 years running and never pulled the trigger because we'd never done it before.
Right.
But the difference for us was we could hire people in more locations, right? It just unlocks the opportunity. And we knew that there were trade-offs to be made, but those trade-offs are not going backwards because it's so hard to get engineering talent in the Bay Area, New York, London. So I think part of it may be experimenting with things like what can you do to drive intervention on this that gets managers to do it? It may be worth thinking about if there's experiments that can be run there.
Totally. Yeah, I would say that this firm has tried to have a strong return to the office among their engineering group, and there seems to have been slight rebellion. So in terms of totally. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree that sort of harnessing nudges seems like a wonderful thing to be able to test. Yeah.
A two-part comment. One is about being able to hire more senior people. To what Brian said, yes, if you say that we're routinely hiring people anywhere, suddenly the available pool of candidates is order of magnitude. That's +1 to what Brian said. Two, in terms of companies, the other example, I've worked at open source companies that are doing the same code review process and they're physically distributed. So it's not just the office one, building 1 and building 2. It's like no offices and it's different time zones. So you can actually, the question here is, could you take that as a comparison against what you have here and see if there's a difference? Because they have been doing that since long before COVID and continue today.
So I'll tell you what we've done within the company, and we can see that the teams that are not just distributed across building, but are distributed across campuses, and so are potentially in these different time zones, we see almost identical trends. And so it does seem as though it's not that necessarily the time zone or the asynchronous piece that's going on, but I think the sort of different context of actually there is no office, and so we're all doing this, and there might be a different culture around that. Seems potentially interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it sort of enforces it sort of normalizes out for the casual conversation. You're talking about the bigger building and the smaller building. Are there more casual conversations in the bigger building? This kind of zeroes that out because everyone's in a different city.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But the question is, do they get less good mentorship because they're all in different cities?
Right. Exactly.
Super interesting. One, like Brian, I've read this a lot. One thing that was new that was, I think, talks to something that's a very topical debate. I just want to ask you about was when you add an extra team member, whether in the same building or the different building, because it's really linked to this whole debate with hybrid as to whether you get people in on the same day and you have like 8 people and one person doesn't come in.
Right.
Does it force everyone onto Zoom? And is that what's going on there? It's like really interesting that somebody new added that's in a different location damages all the current team members. I wondered if you knew.
That's exactly what we think is going on. That just having one person in a different building means that now we're on Zoom rather than meeting in person. And so all the benefits of that schmoozing seem to go out the window. So you could imagine if there is that coordination, then you still might want to meet in person and just have that one person Zooming in rather than everyone in their separate siloed offices Zooming into that meeting.
So I think we have time for one more very short question.
So I've noticed something during COVID and afterwards, and it's related to meeting with graduate students. I think that meeting with graduate students is better online when they can share their screen than when they're shoving their computer across the desk or showing you a piece of paper. So what do you think about that?
Given I am not at an academic institution or mentoring any graduate students, I can't give any personal insight, but I do think that there is an established norm in computer science that they will look at the same screen, regardless of whether it's screen sharing or we're looking on. Yeah, and even sometimes co-coding will happen where somebody's watching as you code in real time. That's like a normal way to train somebody. And so it's not obvious to me that that's at play here, but potentially in the academic context, it makes sense. Thank you so much.
So next we have Anthony Diercks, who's going to tell us about research output before and during the pandemic.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Title is Research Output Before and During the Pandemic. My name is Anthony Diercks. I'm a DC area economist. I have to let you know that these views here are my own. They do not reflect the views of my employer. Okay, so this study is about outcomes associated with fully remote work, not hybrid. So what is the consensus view on fully remote work? Well, look no further than the very well done paper by Barrera, Bloom, and Davis, where they note that fully remote work was associated with about 10% lower productivity. And one potential explanation is that workers kind of maybe have this lack of motivation and self-control. But the studies that are frequently cited to make this kind of claim is that kind of focus on call center and data entry workers. And there's really no example in which fully remote work was more productive. And so all the positive outcomes are kind of attributed to hybrid. So in terms of the big picture, should the negative productivity findings based on call center and data entry workers be generalized and extended to the entire knowledge workforce? Instead, what are the productivity outcomes of fully remote work for individuals that tend to be highly motivated, with advanced degrees? So my goal today is to convince Barrera, Bloom, and Davis to tweak the narrative about fully. There. Fair. All right. Fair enough. Okay. So ask yourself, for any economists, what is the likely effect of fully remote work on productivity? And what I'll tell you is that the number one response I get is that it depends. It depends on the individual. The effect on productivity of fully remote work is heterogeneous. So for some folks, the effect may be negative, while for others, the effects may be positive. So for call center data entry workers, maybe it's negative. For highly motivated individuals with advanced degrees, well, let's stay tuned. One other thing I'd like to point out that there's a literature about fully remote work that has documented objective, not self-assessed positive outcomes for decades. So these are very difficult to find. I'll be honest with you with that. But there's a paper by Geisler from 1978 for Blue Cross Blue Shield, South Carolina. There was written up by Phelps from Mountain Bell in Denver in 1980. Newman looked at Travelers Insurance Company back in 1989. Dubrin looked at the data entry workers for the MPD group in New York. Loy et al. Looked at call center workers at the Kentucky American Water Company. And then Collins looked at some insurance techs at Lloyd's Insurance in the UK. So these are all examples in which they provided, fully remote work that had positive outcomes for productivity. Okay, so again, the goal is to convince you that the effects of fully remote work on productivity are potentially heterogeneous. There's two other studies that speak to this potential heterogeneity. There's Diercks 2012, which provides experimental evidence that remote work for simple and repetitive tasks was associated with about 10% lower productivity. Remote work for tasks requiring critical thinking and creativity was associated with about 20% higher productivity. And then there's a longitudinal study by Monteiro, Strom, and Valente that look at Portuguese firms. They find that remote work had a negative productivity associated with firms primarily employing low-skilled workers. In contrast, remote work had significantly positive productivity effects for firms that undertook research and development activities. So again, do the findings associated with fully remote call center and data entry workers more broadly apply to all knowledge workers? What about researchers or academics? Well, this question's already kind of been received some considerable interest during the pandemic. There's a paper in the Journal of Finance where they documented a self-reported decline in research productivity during the pandemic. In contrast to that, there's a review of financial studies paper that finds that among the top 50 schools, there was a 35% increase in productivity as measured by SSRN paper postings. But what they also noted is that the largest gains accrued to the top 10 schools. There's been a subsequent paper written, looked at the top 1,000 schools, and they found an overall decline in productivity with increased inequality. And they said that maybe the extra time spent on teaching had an important negative effect. But most importantly, out of all this, is that all these studies excluded Federal Reserve System economists, and they did not face these teaching costs. Okay, so during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve System adopted some fully remote policies, much like everyone else. So the question is, were these policies associated with any effect on research output of its economists? Did males, females respond differently? Were certain age demographics affected more than others? What was the impact on collaboration? Was there any effect on inequality among economists? In a general equilibrium model, rationalize any of the findings? And then what would be the macroeconomic effects? So we know that's important because increases in productivity tend to reduce inflation. All right. Okay, so here's what we did. We examined working paper output from the 12 Federal Reserve System regional banks, as well as a richer measure of output for board authors. The working papers are a consistent and relatively parsimonious measure, which persists across all regional banks. Kind of avoided some issues associated with lag times related to the publication process. So we use quarterly output per author as our measure of interest, and then we construct a time series for each author. So of course, there's caveats to using working papers. Working papers are obviously just one dimension of output. For the 12 regional banks, we did not include publications, revisions, book chapters, notes, and other research contributions. And then output related to policy work is not included yet, also important. And some economists use SSRN to release new papers, which we are not tracking. Of course, there's also caveats to using the pandemic. The pandemic was a unique time period And so one perspective on results coming from the pandemic is you had this land grab of papers on COVID. You had more demand for papers on COVID. You had the short run, long run trade-off, less time on conferences, less lunch with colleagues, more just pumping out papers. So as robustness checks, we're going to try to exclude COVID papers. We're going to exclude 2020. Vaccines were more widely available in 2021. So maybe we had more in-person activities at that point. And then we're also going to check what happened around the financial crisis, which would be a similar land grab event. Okay, so we created a database for each regional bank, which contained an entry for every working paper written by a Federal Reserve author. We documented demographic information for each author, gender, job title, PhD year, starting and ending dates, mostly by consulting CVs, bios, and LinkedIn profiles. This is all public data. We constructed a time series for each author at each regional bank, and then the board containing quarterly output totals from 2018 Q1 to 2021 Q4. We excluded economists who did not produce working papers over this time period and were not present at the start of the pandemic. So now we coded the pandemic as starting in 2020 Q2 through 2021 Q4. And so what we had was we had 437 authors with 1,500 working papers from the regional banks. And then we had 500 authors with about 2,400 research pieces from the board. Okay, so this is one of the first pictures. This is the summary statistics. And what I'm showing here is the percent change in output per author per quarter for pre versus during COVID. So on the left, you're going to see the regional banks. In the middle, you see the board, and then you see all is combined. And what you see is the regional banks, there's about a 20% increase. For the board, you see about a 30% increase. And if you combine them, you get about a 25% increase. So the takeaway here is that the entire system had about a 25% increase in output for this time period. Now that's just a summary statistic. We can also use some regressions to make things more formal. And given that we're using count data, which is zero bounded and right skewed, we can use Poisson regressions in addition to linear regressions, shaped by Cohen-Liu-Ward law that show Poisson regressions are more appropriate for this type of data. And we also can control for author fixed effects. All right, so now here's the regressions. I've tried to color code things, make it look a little bit nicer, but it's not showing perfectly on the screen. But nonetheless, there's three panels here. There's a Federal Reserve, the regional banks, the Board of Governors, the combined. I'm just going to focus on the combined. What you see here is the constant in yellow. It's about 0.25. That's papers per quarter. So you multiply that by 4. You get about 1 working paper per year per economist in the pre-COVID time period. And then look in the Poisson kind of shows you the percentage changes. So for the regional banks, you had about a 17% increase. The board had about 28%, and the combined there was about 23.9% increase. So the takeaway here is that there were large, significant gains across the entire system during the pandemic. So then the next question is, all right, let's start splitting up the data to see who's driving this. The first thing we did was we split the sample up into the top and bottom half based on pre-COVID production. And so here, again, for the pre-COVID time period, you can see the constant of about 0.094. You multiply by that by 4, that's about 0.5 papers per year for the bottom half of the distribution. For the top half, you see a coefficient of 0.3. You add that to the constant, multiplied by 4, you get about 1.5 papers per year for the top half of the distribution. Then we can look at during COVID. What you're going to see here is that for the COVID coefficient, it's about 0.13. So the bottom half of the distribution nearly doubled its output over this time period. You then look at the COVID time to top half interaction term. You see that it's negative, but you got to remember that you add that negative term to the COVID term, and you get basically a 0 coefficient. So the top half remained productive, but unchanged. So the takeaway here is that the gains in output were really driven by the bottom half of the distribution, and inequality declined, which is very different from what we saw with the university professors. All right, we can then look at males versus females. Again, the constant here is about 0.25, which suggests that there was about 1 paper per year for males pre-COVID. If you look at the female coefficient, it's about negative 0.009. So that's an insignificant difference for pre-COVID between males and females. There's a very small difference. During COVID, you see again that males increased their output by 24%. There's a negative coefficient for the females, but again, you add that to the COVID coefficient. See the females increased their output by 21%. That's an insignificant difference. So the takeaway here is that there was no significant difference between males and females pre and during COVID. And again, that contrasts with the evidence coming from the university professors, which found statistical significance. Okay, we can also do this by age. And so we split this up into under 8 years, 8 to 22 years, and over 22 years. And for under 8 years, these are the younger folks. And what you'll see is that they had about a 16% more relative output than everyone else during COVID. So you take that coefficient and you add it to the other one, and you see that they had 36% more output compared to pre-COVID. So the takeaway here is that the youngest cohort actually gained the most during the pandemic. And that goes against this view that kind of the youngest do relatively poorly under fully remote. Now, if you move to the 8 to 22 years, this is more of the age where people have small children. What you see here is you see a negative coefficient of about 17% less relative output than everyone else during COVID. But again, you have to sum up the two coefficients. So you take 0.34 minus 0.17. They still were 16% more productive. It's just the takeaway here is that although the gains were not as large as the other age groups, they were still significantly positive over this time period. Lastly, you can look at the oldest age group. There you see an 8% relative gain compared to everyone else. You add that on to the COVID coefficient, and you see that the oldest cohort, they were about 29% more productive. Here the takeaway is that the gains, relative to other cohorts were positive, but it was insignificant. Okay, so that's the regressions. Now let's think about some of the robustness checks. So these gains could be driven by just the presence of new research ideas and not necessarily to do with fully remote. And this view rests on the assumption that the constraining factor on researchers prior to COVID was not time, but a limited number of research ideas. So the global financial crisis is another time period in which there was a new shock to do research on, yet there were no changes in work from home policies over this time period. So this could possibly serve as a good period for comparison. Okay, so what we did here is to do this for the financial crisis, we compared the number of working papers from 2005 to 2008 versus 2009 to 2010. And then on the vertical axis is the percent change in research output. And so what you'll see is in blue is the pandemic. And that's exactly the results I showed you before. They were relatively positive across all the regional banks and the board combined. But then when you look at the situation for the board here, you see that during the financial crisis, the board had 18% decline in the papers that were produced. And so system-wide, if you include the board, the papers actually declined about 1%. So the takeaway here is that we didn't see a large increase in research output around the financial crisis in contrast to the pandemic. Another thing we can do is we can exclude 2020. If you exclude 2020, you see a relatively smaller effect, but you still see a positive and economically meaningful increase of about 11%. You can also exclude papers that have about the COVID or the pandemic. Once you do that, you see a smaller effect as you might expect, but it's still a positive and significant effect of around 10%. All right, what about collaboration? We can also check collaboration based on the authors per paper. And that's something that we did. If you look here, the constant here suggests that, before COVID, the average number of authors per paper was about 3. And then when we compare that to the during COVID time period, you actually saw a 10% rise in the authors per paper. So the takeaway here again is that there's a significant increase potentially in collaboration across the system, even when controlling for the time trend. So some reasons why work from home may increase output. The average US employee saves about 70 minutes a day by avoiding having to commute, prepare for work, which is split into both additional work and leisure. Home working is often better suited for individual focused activities like coding or writing, as it's usually quieter, allows for greater time flexibility. There's also this idea that you can control the ambient workspace, such as your clothing, layout, ventilation. And there's also the view from Raj that it's potentially the case that these workers experience greater satisfaction and utility and will exert greater productivity enhancing effort in appreciation of the non-pecuniary benefit. So that's kind of the empirical results. I can now move you to kind of the theoretical model. This is we're just going to use a standard new Keynesian model with endogenous growth. You want to use endogenous growth because it allows for potential effects on productivity. So given that Bloom et al. Found that there was about a 70 minutes a day in savings, we can simulate just a 1% increase, exogenous increase in the time endowment. And so given that typical model has households working a third of the time, the total endowment is typically 120 hours a week, 40 of which are devoted to labor. So 1% increase is roughly an additional hour per week. And that's consistent with the findings of Exo et al. In 2023. So what happens when we simulate that? Well, there's a lot of figures here, but I'll go through them nice and slowly. So in the lower right, you're going to see that the time endowment persistently rises by about 1%. And what happens once that happens? Well, you see an increase in the labor supply of about 0.35%. And then you also see an increase in leisure. But as you increase the labor supply, what's going to happen is that it's going to translate into higher output growth, which is also going to translate into higher consumption. And as you have more labor, it's going to increase the marginal product of research and development. So R&D investment is going to go up. And that's going to also lead to higher idea accumulation. And as you have greater idea accumulation, that's going to spill over into higher productivity growth. Likewise, in terms of the macro outcomes, you're going to see that as you have a higher labor supply, it's going to be associated with lower real wages and lower inflation. And then that lower inflation is going to translate into potentially lower risk-free rates. So yeah, you increase the labor supply, it's going to increase output. As you have more labor, it's going to increase the marginal product of research and development. That's going to spill over into greater idea accumulation and greater productivity in these models. All right, and then here's just one last thing I want to show on this, and this is just very kind of relatively superficial. There's a lot of issues with this, but this is just showing the level of productivity along with its trend. So that you can see right here, in orange is the trend, and in blue is the actual observed productivity. And here I can then show you the growth in that productivity, how it jumped up during the pandemic and then declined quite a bit. And on the right side, what I'm actually plotting is the number of mentions of RTO, return to office. And so what I'm trying to show you here is that the rise in productivity and recent decline are consistent with model implications based on an increase in the time endowment and then a reduction in the time endowment. Now, there's a lot of other composition issues, so I'm not going to try to stress this. I'm just saying that what you see here is actually consistent with what the model is predicting. So in conclusion, we find that research output significantly increased during fully remote. The bottom half of the distribution was responsible for the large gains. In addition, there was an increase that was driven by the younger and relatively older cohorts. There was no significant difference between males and females. Collaboration as measured by authors per paper significantly increased. Findings can be rationalized in a generally good model with exogenous increase in time endowment. Of course, the caveat here is this is just a study about productivity. There's a lot of other factors that go into companies and firms' decisions about what they do with their remote work. And there's just one final thought. I don't know how much time I have. If I'm going too fast or too slow. Okay. Okay. Just one final thought real quick. This is just my final thought because I have this venue. There exists a scenario out there that combines positive aspects of fully remote and hybrid. And to me, it's like kind of this idea of cluster hybrid, where you kind of get everyone together for these core weeks, every 6 or so weeks, and you get many of the benefits of fully remote work, where you have these cost savings, nationwide talent search, people can live where they want. But then you also have this in-person, dynamic that's also very important. So I just want to put that out there. So thank you.
Hi, really interesting. My question is colored by the fact that I was a board RA during the Great Financial Crisis in the real estate section. And the thing that people are doing a lot when they're in the middle of these kinds of crises is doing a lot of policy work, right? That's what some sections end up getting consumed by. And so what I was really looking for in some of these figures was a comparison of outcomes for the sections that were more or less connected to the policy work associated with that particular crisis. Because that could be a lot of time that's spent on for some sections.
That's a very good suggestion. That's a good suggestion.
So there's a lot of interesting variation across the different feds and how remote they are right now. So the Fed board is, my understanding is something like 6 or 8 days in person a month or something like that. And I think the St. Louis Fed is like relatively in person. And my understanding is it's fairly idiosyncratic which feds are choosing which path. So I feel like just by calling up a few people, you could figure out the policies and then do kind of a cross-sectional test across the different federal branches.
That's a very good suggestion. And I do not disagree with you at all. So that would be good to look at. Definitely.
Thanks. I want to try to make sense of some of the numbers at a basic level.
Yep.
So you told us that you get an extra hour a week of labor supply. from the time savings. That sounds right. It's consistent with the evidence that I've seen. That's about a 2.5% increase in labor supply on a 40-hour work week. Okay, but so somehow we got from 2.5% increase in labor supply to a 25% increase in output.
You mean for the
For the empirical results, and you're telling us the model is rationalizing that. There's a big gap between 2.5% and 25%. I'm wondering where it comes from according to the model, according to your view. One possibility is that we're just more efficient per unit time when we're working remotely. Is that what's happening in your model, or is it spillover effects across?
So this model is just it's a representative agent, just general equilibrium
No, but
macro model.
okay, maybe you told us that the model rationalizes.
I said some of the findings, I was asking, does the model
So
rationalize any of the findings? And what I found was that higher productivity was associated with increased time. That's all I was conveying.
Okay, but does it quantitatively rationalize the results or just directionally?
I was thinking more along the qualitative dimension.
Okay.
So that's fair. That's a fair comment.
Hi, very interesting paper. I have two comments. The first is inspired by Lindsay's comment, since I was also a board RA during the global financial crisis. During something like a financial crisis, it seems like really important for economists at the board and at the banks. And so obviously this isn't something you can address empirically here, but if we're thinking about like potential policies, having staff be there when they really need them seems, much more important than, or it seems qualitatively different than the effects you might expect on research output or sort of normal times. But you might actually have, I don't know, if there's any way for you to address that empirically, it would be interesting, but I don't know if it's possible.
I agree.
My second comment was thinking about people who start in the post-remote work era. That's sort of related to some of the previous papers we've seen. I started a new job during the pandemic in the remote work era. And my research, what happened to my research collaborations was that I basically continued collaborating effortlessly with people at my old institution, but had much more difficulty starting new collaborations at my new institution.
Yeah, that's very fair comment. Very fair.
I'm Callum Williams from The Economist. I just got a quick question about this COVID exclusion that you applied to the data to sort of essentially control for the demand shock that you get to research during the pandemic. I guess I wonder whether that's a sufficient control, because certainly my experience as a journalist was that there was a huge amount of demand for news, or huge increase in demand for all sorts of news during 2020 and 2021, even things that were only tangentially or not even at all related to COVID per se. So the role of the state, the role of the welfare state, the role of fiscal policy, the role of monetary policy, Chinese-American relations, and so on and so forth. And so certainly at The Economist, one thing that drove productivity for us was just that there was a lot of demand for news as a whole. So I wonder, is there a way around this? Are you able to focus maybe on like a division of the Fed that has absolutely nothing to do with the news at all, and see what happens to productivity in that department? And that would seem like a clean way of isolating the effects you're trying to describe.
That's a good suggestion. So I'm not sure that I can do that. That's a good approach potentially to address that.
So very interesting paper. So I just want to build on what Steve said about how 4% endowment of extra time leads to 25% productivity. So drawing on my own experience, I was thinking whether the collaboration production function changes here, because the search cost of looking for distant collaborators is now changing, right? So personally, for me, I started working, contrary to the point made earlier, I found more distant collaborators during this period. And it's something you can empirically test, right? So are they going beyond the DC area to collaborate with economists elsewhere?
That's very good. Yep. Very good question.
I also had a related comment, and following up on Raj's comment, I was wondering whether the COVID actually kind of democratized the access to new research networks, in the sense that now, you have access to MBR meetings, but now it's online. You reach out to people, someone from Harvard and someone from Fed, probably you guys had access to this type of networks, but now it's easier to reach out to these people. I think with the data you have, you can understand whether quality of co-authors also increase.
That's very good. Yeah, definitely.
All right, I think we're good for the final. Great, so the final paper in the session will be presented by Ben Etheridge, again about worker productivity during COVID, and in particular looking at adaptations.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here, of course. So this is joint work with Ashley Burdett and Yikai Wang, who are colleagues at Essex, and Li Tang, who used to be at Essex and is now at Middlesex. Okay, so I'll be brief with background and motivation. Okay, so the kind of bigger picture question that we're kind of thinking about with this study is that the rise of working from home was, of course, one of the most salient features of the COVID pandemic. And then post-pandemic, I think surprisingly quickly, most of socioeconomic life has returned to the old normal, as if the pandemic was kind of just a bad dream. But working from home as kind of the new normal has persisted. And so an important question is why, and several papers in this conference are about that. Well, the obvious answer is because people like it, but the more subtle question is, how did we get here? Okay, so what we do is explore individuals' experiences of working from home during the pandemic in the UK setting. And when I talk about experiences, that's broadly, I'm going to focus on worker productivity, which as economists we think of as, probably the most important thing. And also going to think about the role of their circumstances. So our aims are to provide new evidence on what causes effective working from home and how this drove working from home adherence as the pandemic progressed. Okay, so what are we actually going to do in this paper? So we have to go over the data. So we use representative panel data from the UK Household Longitudinal Survey, which if you don't know is a kind of a standard panel data like the PSID, although it's much larger and much newer, so it's kind of more representative than the PSID, which has particularly rich, and I'd say uniquely rich data collected throughout the pandemic, including information on self-reported productivity. And just to be concrete, I'm going to talk about like change relative to a baseline, so people report, plus 10%, or negative 10%, or whatever. And then worker location, whether they're in the home or in the office. And actually that was collected before the pandemic as well. Okay, so if I had more time, I would, I'd sell the data, spend half an hour talking about the data, but I don't. So I'll just say a few bullet points to advocate their strength, because I think they're a really useful resource actually going forward as well, because there's data before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and there's soon to be data kind of post-pandemic. So it's kind of unusual around the world that we see the same individuals quite high frequency across the whole pandemic. And the question on self-reported productivity is also kind of unusually precise in that it asks about the speed of task completion. So it has quite a precise interpretation. And the paper, we do quite a lot of validation of these data, both externally, kind of predictive validity in the language of psychologists, and internally, because we actually kind of have more than one measure within each wave. And then we have all these measures across waves. Of course, I don't have time to talk about those, but you can ask about them, about them afterwards if you like. Okay, so to set this time with the scene with some basic patterns to kind of talk about our contribution. Productivity during COVID-19 was on average similar to before, but there's systematic heterogeneity in several dimensions. So over time, going in and out of lockdowns. Today I'm going to focus on a couple of aspects which are gender, family, and job characteristics. So, these things were kind of, I guess, have been known through various studies by people here, but I'm going to kind of speak to them more as in a moment. So, for example, mothers performed worse during lockdowns, although we see some catch up between mothers and mothers compared to fathers as the pandemic progressed. To the second lockdown, mothers is much more closely to fathers than in the first lockdown. And as we all know, kind of high earners perform better, and there are multiple reasons for that. Their jobs are more remotable, that kind of thing. Okay, so kind of more novelly, we want to make a couple of kind of points in this paper which kind of speak to adaptation to working from home as the pandemic progressed. Okay, so we can track individuals, as I said, over time and where they were located. And we find that there was systematic sorting based on idiosyncratic productivity experiences. So I've just spoken about kind of observable characteristics, but now I'm talking about condition on those characteristics. We see that people who report being more productive when they're at home, they're much more likely to be at home later in their pandemic. But actually, we see that the marginal group shifted over the course of the pandemic as we kind of went into and out of lockdowns. And so I'll kind of invite, I think, illuminating ways, and I'll come back to that when I talk about the results in detail. So one implication of this is this kind of novel kind of micro evidence on micro behavior that kind of speaks to why in the second lockdown, for example, the UK economy performed much better than in the first lockdown. And again, there's multiple reasons for that, but this is one contributing factor. Okay, so secondly, what we do is we want to think about which factors affect productivity across locations. So I've just shown that location is endogenous. So we do that in the paper by addressing for kind of sorting using pre-pandemic commuting patterns about which there's kind of rich information in the survey before the pandemic. So people report how they were traveling to work. Okay, so building on what I said earlier about focusing on gender, family, and job characteristics. So we can find broadly that kind of these differences were kind of most seen in the home location. Okay, so in office, when we think about the production function in the office, people look kind of fairly similar to before the pandemic. And these kind of differences emerge in the kind of home environment production function. So parents performed worse at home only. And then going into more detail about this high earners, we go into, we look at some kind of components of being a high earner. So we see that managers perform better at home only compared to non-managers. In the office, we see no difference compared to pre-pandemic. And then something that you don't get from kind of studies of individual firms, we can look at, we have information about the size of the firm that people are working at. And obviously, people working at large firms tend to be kind of higher earners. And we see that employees at large firms perform better compared to employees at smaller firms. At home only, we don't see a difference in the office. So that, again, that speaks to kind of evidence that's out there that larger firms were more able to kind of invest in technology which help remote work. And then, if I have time, I hope to, we have many other results on kind of housing conditions. Well, a few results on housing conditions. And then a nice feature of the survey is we have before the pandemic, we have this rich information on personality traits and cognitive skills. And so we see some kind of interesting results on that level as well. Okay, so to set the scene for the collection of the data, so you have in mind, also the pandemic in the UK and when the data were collected. So we have 2020 and 2021. And the orange line is hospitalization rates. And then these dark gray bars are lockdowns, and these light gray bars are kind of these kind of semi-lockdown periods. And obviously the white periods are when we had kind of more or less kind of freedom of movement with some caveats. So the top blue dots are kind of regular survey collection. And then we have the COVID survey, which was done at very high frequency. And then the questions on reported productivity are with the green dots, and there's some kind of subtle differences in the nature of question, which I won't go into. But importantly, we have two collections in kind of lockdown periods in June 2020 and in January 2021, which was kind of heaviest lockdown in the UK, or the heaviest kind of instance of COVID. And then we have these two from kind of lighter, when there's more kind of freedom and people are kind of freer to return back to the office. Okay, so I'm going to kind of talk about our work on how people's productivity experiences drove their location choices. Okay, so to do this, we run ordered logit models of working from home on a full set of individual and job characteristics, and a full set of lag terms of where you were in the, in all observed previous periods. with the previous last working from home status interacted with your productivity, reported productivity change since before the pandemic. Okay, and so the groups we have, I mean, yeah, so in the survey there's a slightly finer segmentation. We're grouping people into not working at home, so then in the office, and then full-time working at home, and then we have kind of hybrid workers or part-time at home in the middle. Okay, so we see working from home doesn't just depend on occupational characteristics we knew before, but also in these individual realizations of productivity. So the marginal group changes. So we've got 3 transitions going from the first lockdown to the first kind of eased restrictions. And we see that you're much more likely to be working from home, or more likely to be working from home if you were working from home in the first lockdown full time and reported higher productivity. So these are people all thrown back home. Obviously, the ones who found they were doing well, they're more likely to stay at home. People who didn't like it or weren't doing well, they were brought back into the office. Obviously, there's a joint decision between individual and the firm, or or maybe it's a decision all by the firm. There's some bargaining, I suppose. Okay, in terms of quantification, so we find 10 percentage point higher productivity for a threshold worker, leads to 3 percentage points more likely to be working from home in the next period. So, I mean, that estimate is likely highly attenuated. I mean, so our measure of productivity is obviously measured with noise. As I said, in principle, we do have more than one measure of productivity in each wave. So we could try and kind of do a measurement, instrument for that, but it's very non-classical. So it would require, it's probably kind of pretty infeasible. And I'll come back to this later. So unfortunately, there's no data for those who are never at home in this first lockdown. Okay, so I've got these 3 transitions. So I'm talking about the first transition on the left-hand side. I said the full time, we see that they're more likely. So I've got these kind of marginal effect of lagged change in productivity from the previous period. And so we see this dark blue is the significant result. Those who are working full time at home, they're more likely to go to stay at home in the first easing. Okay, so going from then the first easing in September to the second lockdown, we have that, of course, well, those who are full time working at home, well, now whether or not they reported kind of good productivity, it's irrelevant because everyone's kind of coming back home. So it turns out to the people who are working part-time at home that they're kind of more responsive to their productivity. Okay, and we see this in the middle picture. So on the right-hand side of the middle picture, that's people who are full-time at home. Of course, the standard errors are now large because there's no movement there. They're all kind of, give or take some misclassification, they're all staying at home in the lockdown. But the people who are part-time at home, they're still responsive. Okay, so then going from the second lockdown to to the end of the survey when kind of COVID is kind of just in the background and there's vaccinations around and people are kind of feeling more easy about it. So now, interestingly, I think we find that this marginal effect is strongest for those who were full-time in the office. So now those who are more productive than pre-COVID are much less likely to return home. So the interpretation is, okay, so these people, they've had some experience of working from home. In the second lockdown, they're back in the office. And now if they find that they're productive in the office, they're going to stay there. These are people who clearly don't like being at home. Okay, or vice versa, they go back into the office, they weren't productive there, so then maybe they return home. Okay, so this is on the right-hand side, the kind of heavy blue line is the strongest quantitative results. Unfortunately, we don't have the same guys or people who are working in the office in the first lockdown, as I said, for kind of data collection reasons. Okay, so we've shown that your reported productivity drives location as the pandemic evolves. Of course, the first sort of question is thinking about how does location affect your productivity in the first place? Okay, and that's obviously question in the QJ next QJ paper is what is the treatment effect of working from home, and coming at this from a kind of Roy model framework. I think of there's you think of the treatment effect, And then you also think about what's the production function across kind of treatments here, what drive, what are the marginal effects of different characteristics at home versus in the office. Okay, so we're going to focus on number 2 because our kind of data are not powerful enough to kind of estimate treatment effect of working from home. And of course, you know, the strength of our setting is we have kind of representative data across occupations, whereas it doesn't really make sense to talk about treatment effects compared to, you know, combined treatment effects across hospitality, you know, with IT coders. Okay, but so we're going to think about, you know, what's the effect of being a parent versus non-parent in these 2 locations. Okay, so as I said, we're going to use a, you know, kind of Roy model, a sample selection model, instrumenting now a kind of binary for working from home. So we combine the part-time with the full-time into any working from home with people who are full-time in the office. We're going to instrument with pre-pandemic commuting mode, as I said, you know, that's collected, that's not just retrospective questions, that's collected before the pandemic, interacted with distance and difficulty of travel. Okay, and yeah, I'll move on. Okay, the instruments are fairly strong. So distance and difficulty of commuting important for both car and public transport users. So I guess these are, you know, there are multiple interpretations of these. So we actually find, I'll go to the results. So actually the main thing is this distance to work with, interact with public transport. So our interpretation of that is, you know, people don't like a long commute by public transport during the pandemic, don't like being exposed to infection. The car, it's travel difficulties. I guess the interpretation there is more, you know, they've had 5 years of this horrendous commute by car and they're just fed up with it and they jump at any chance to work from home. Okay, so I've already, you know, described some results, and I said important effects of characteristics are mainly seen at home. In the office, we see fewer differences across people. I mean, there's some more subtleties to this. So as I said, we see parents at home, they have a negative effect compared to non-parents, relative to non-parents. Although conditional on parenting, the female penalty is seen in the office. Okay, as I said, as managers, employees in large firms, you know, they have this kind of positive effect relative to non-managers, not relative to employees at small firms in the home only, but not in the office. And then I'll show you the results in a moment, but other effects kind of not discussed today. So housing characteristics. So there's a question on having enough desk space or having desk space. That's important at home, obviously not in the office. That kind of is a, you know, a falsification test of our data, I suppose. And then I think some interesting results, so the cognitive function is actually quite strong in the data, but it's surprising. So we find that the returns to being smart seem to be blunted at home, which I think I was kind of expecting the opposite. I mean, there's a narrative that, you know, being at home allows us to do all kind of thinking work, but this is obviously all conditional on the job type. But within job type, yeah, the returns to cognition seem to be less effective at home, but it's the same in the office. And then personality, we actually see positive effects kind of across locations. So it speaks to more the kind of pandemic environment in general of agreeableness and conscientiousness. And we, you know, discuss some interpretation of those in the paper. Okay, so I'll show you the tables from these. Okay, so at the top we have this negative parent effect at home, but not in the office. I said the female penalty. It seems I've done this as a male here, but yeah, think of it as the female penalty is in the office. And then managerial returns to kind of, or the positive effect of managers versus relative to non-managers is at home, not in the office. And log size of firm, again, at home, not in the office. Okay, and then finally, you know, having desk space at home, but not in the office. Okay, so to round up, so we examined productivity during COVID-19 and its relationship with the evolution of working from home. Productivity was highly heterogeneous, and working from home take-up evolved as individuals experienced productivity realizations, and the determinants of productivity vary across locations.
Thanks for that. A lot of interesting data there. You talked about attenuation bias. in the your assessment of the impact of productivity during the pandemic on later take up of work from home. And you stress measurement error in your the role of measurement error in your measure of productivity, but that's not the whole thing. There's two sources of measurement error, because there's a conceptual measurement error. Because what should drive the change in behavior isn't the idiosyncratic productivity realization. It's the surprise component of that. If it's just that you're more productive in work from home mode, but you already knew that before the pandemic, that's not news. There's no reason for that to drive behavior. So in the work I've done with these first three guys over here and others, what we look at is not the idiosyncratic realization, but the surprise component of the realization of productivity and work from home mode, and relate that to later work from home outcomes. So there's what I'm trying to say is there's not just a measurement error source of attenuation in the key relationship you're estimated, but the concept that you're actually sticking on the right-hand side is not the theoretically appropriate one.
Yeah, right. Okay, point taken. I mean, certainly in the first lockdown, we would say it's all innovation. It's all kind of unforeseen, I guess.
No, that's not right. The event of the pandemic's unforeseen. Then the impact on that's different than the surprise component of my productivity. Okay, you can implicitly assume that the idiosyncratic component of the realized difference is identical to a surprise. That's fine, but that's a maintained assumption. And to the extent that assumption is violated, you're going to get a second source of attenuation bias.
Yeah, okay. So if I understand you correctly, I mean, but let's say that no one knew how productive they were going to be at home in the first lockdown.
Well, that's the maintained assumption.
Yeah, sure. Okay, okay.
But presumably that's in practice, some people had some sense of how productive they would be. And so even conceptually, even if you had no measurement error in your productivity measure per se, there's still this conceptual source of measurement error, which is leading to a further attenuation bias. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
Sure, yeah, okay, sure. And I guess, exiting the pandemic. Okay, so let's go back to the first lockdown versus later on. So even if they had some expectation, they knew how productive they are at home. We're looking within the pandemic, so maybe they don't know how productive they are at home in a pandemic. Leaving the pandemic, we're going back to a world of
to put it in a constructive way. You've got this very strong maintained assumption that the idiosyncratic realized variation is identical to the surprise. Sure. You could just vary that assumption and say, okay, suppose the signal to noise. Think about exactly how to do it, but you could make alternative assumptions, and that would generate an implication for how much attenuation bias you're getting from this particular source.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So I was curious if you could say something more about your finding that for managers working at home was particularly positive. And I mean, that seems a little bit counterintuitive if you think that, mentoring people, supervising people is different when you're remote. One, and second is, so we have this result in our survey of working arrangements and attitudes that among people over 50, managers really wanted to be back in the office, but non-managers didn't. So I think trying to interact this performance of managers against other characteristics like age or perhaps occupation might be something interesting to look at.
Right. Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, so I hadn't seen the result about managers wanting to go back into the office, and right, sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there were, of course, I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to kind of. I suppose there are so many aspects to kind of productivity and as I said, it's kind of speed of task completion. I mean, there is one interpretation that for managers in particular, there's so many distractions, and so in terms of speed of task completion, when you're at home, you can unclick your turn off broadband or whatever, or whatever you're doing. maybe you can kind of switch off the phone. So yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, yeah, no, I'd have to think about it more, and I'm trying to not. I suppose there are so many aspects to productivity, and we're focusing on one of them. Maybe that's a kind of both strength and a weakness of the study. You can think about doing these it's kind of making people think about these kind of quite narrowly specified tasks, maybe, rather than their job more broadly.
Yeah, really interesting. One question is that we get asked a lot, and I guess many people get asked this about self-assessed productivity. So whenever I talk to, non-academics, they're always kind of skeptical of self-assessed productivity. One thing that made me think about this as well is Natalia and Emma's paper from earlier, because there's two measures of output. One is, what I achieve per day, but that ignores maybe I mentor and provide input to others. And the second is also provide input for others. And I wonder, I don't know what people mean when they respond, but if I'm like a manager, a lot of my output, I may be better at doing the day-to-day thing, but not as good at training and mentoring others. And it's a kind of an open, it's like how long is a piece of string? But for us, I don't know if anyone else here knows of anything where they compared self-assessed to realized, because it's kind of hard to know what people mean.
Yeah, no, so I agree on the kind of, my interpretation is people are not thinking about the mentoring when, managers ask this question, right? So, yes, I mean, yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Super interesting. This is Simon. One question about the defining that productivity outcomes at home are more positive at larger firms. Could that be driven by management practices, better work from home technology at these large firms?
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. That's yeah, no, that's the interpretation I think these large firms were able to invest in. I mean, I think that's been documented and discussed. Yeah.
Large firms also have open office floor plans, which have been shown to actually be detrimental to productivity and interaction. So maybe working from home is just more productive because you get more space to do it.
Sure.
Raj, go back to your US Patent and Trade Office study and redo it, but ask people for their perception of so if you think back to the question about perceived versus actual, there probably are ways to do it, but you have to do this sort of work where you're looking at, patent output, patent quality on the productivity on one side, but you're also pulling workers at the same time. It's an interesting idea because I've been reliant on the survey aspect of it, and the two, I've never seen the two done side by side. It'd be really interesting for somebody to do that.
Yeah.
Great. So I think that's it for the session.